Then the disciples Then the disciples of John came to him, saying, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast often, but your disciples do not fast?" And Jesus said to them, "The wedding attendants cannot mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them, can they? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast. No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old cloak, for the patch pulls away from the cloak, and a worse tear is made. Neither is new wine put into old wineskins. Otherwise the skins burst, and the wine is spilled, and the skins are ruined. But new wine is put into fresh wineskins, and so both are preserved." Welcome, Dr. Betty Pries.
Good morning. It is good to be here with you this morning. I have already experienced the blessing of this special place, this congregation, both in my gathering with some of your leaders yesterday and also in worship this morning. You truly are an outpost of God's mercy here in this world, and I thank you for that. Several years ago, I heard a talk given at a church conference by Brene Brown, a woman who some of you will know through her online presentations. She's a social work professor who has interviewed thousands of people about their longing in life, what they're looking for, what their needs are, and why they feel disconnected from themselves and from the world. What she said was, the vast majority of people with whom she speaks are looking for meaning, purpose, and belonging. And then she said she also meets congregations who are declining and struggling. And she says the irony of this, of course, is that churches are in the business of meaning, purpose, and belonging. That's the center of your gifting. In fact, those words on that piece of paper, many of them are about meaning, purpose, and belonging. And so Brene Brown, she said, why is it that these people longing for meaning, purpose, and belonging, why are they not finding their way to the church? And why is the church not finding its way to these folks? It's a very interesting question, and when I heard her make this statement, I thought, yes, this has absolutely been my experience. To make matters even more complex, in my observation, a large number of people who are still in the church are simply hanging on by their fingernails. Or some have exited altogether. And when people are asked, when I ask people, why are you not fully in? Why do you have 1 foot out or more? And sometimes what they say to me is, I am looking for meaning, purpose, and belonging. I'm not quite finding it here. And for some who have exited altogether, some would say they're not even sure what it is they're looking for. Sadly, when people who are fully in to the church, when they hear this, those with hands and feet and bodies fully into this community of faith, they can sometimes shake their head in disbelief, and they think, how can this be? It is at church, precisely at church, where I find meaning, purpose, and belonging. Several years ago, I was working with a congregation who was struggling with this very issue. And the congregation had had a series of focus group conversations, and then a report was written. And the report identified that a significant portion of the congregation, especially those who were born after 1965, they described a profound spiritual longing that was not being met by the current way of doing church. And there, during a congregational meeting that followed, several people said, but we have Bible studies. Why can't those people with longing come there? Or they said, I don't understand what these people aren't getting. We have great worship services. And the sense of grief and sorrow among those whose needs were met at church was palpable. The suggestion for them that the church was not meeting other people's needs felt almost like an accusation, even though it wasn't intended that way. Those with spiritual longings were asked to put more flesh on those words. What does it mean? What are your longings? And they were never able to speak it clearly because it was a longing that had no words. Or you could say it was a longing that goes deeper than words. When they tried to identify their longing, it began to look like this: depth, authenticity, and a sense of a lived connection with God's presence. And not surprisingly, those on the other side said, "That's what we get at church. How come you're not getting it here?" And so we reached an impasse, and people didn't know what to say or do next. And although this particular story that I've just shared occurred in a specific congregation, I encounter variations of this dialogue with almost every congregation with whom I work. 29 years ago, when I first began working in this field and with congregations, I did not hear this conversation very much, or if it was there, it was muted. And now this conversation is central to almost every congregation with whom I work. What's going on? I'd like to offer you a few statistics, anecdotes, and some commentary to help us get a sense of the context that we're in. We are living in a time of tremendous change, and of course you know this. Some people would argue that the change that we're living in is greater than any change we've seen in the last 500, 1,000, or 2,000 years. And other people say, oh, every generation thinks they're in a time of great change. And I say maybe that's true. It's just that this is our moment of change. And what does it mean to understand our moment of change that we're living in? The change that we're experiencing as a culture is rapid. It is intense, it is dizzying, and it has consequences. And for those of us who are living and breathing this change, finding our footing can feel like running on ice or trying to stand on quicksand. In other words, it's not easy at all to find our footing. And part of what makes this so dizzying is that there are multiple streams of change converging on us at the same time. And of course, the pandemic has kind of ramped up that change for all of us. It's had a huge impact on our congregations, our sense of security, and our overall sense of exhaustion. We want to be free of this virus. And just to give you a window into this, earlier this week I was working with a group of medical professionals. One of the things that they said was just how impatient people in the waiting room are these days. And an article that I was reading recently said, once upon a time, the little old ladies in the waiting room would bring cookies for the staff, and now they give the staff the finger. Right? And everybody we are collectively in a time of great exhaustion. But there's more. With each week, it seems, our society is polarizing another stretch further into the extremes. The pandemic has torn open the curtain of societal injustice that's now demanding attention. And it's not just the pandemic, it's the pandemic plus George Floyd's murder, or the pandemic plus what we in Canada have discovered is all these unmarked graves around former residential schools. It's the pandemic plus the people who died in the pandemic who are primarily the people most vulnerable in our society. There's something that's been torn open for us that's demanding attention. Of course, mask and vaccine mandates have frayed relationships and congregations in particular. Politics are fraught with division, and now the drums of war are beating again. The environment is hanging in a balance, and if you are feeling overwhelmed or afraid, you're not alone. You are in good company. How did we get here? I want to offer just two streams of contributors to the current polarization. There are more, but just two. On the one hand, we observe a major philosophical shift that influences everything from faith to social norms to how we raise our children. This philosophical shift allows everything to be questioned. Everything to be questioned, including the existence of God, the value of faith, the concept of truth, social norms, and so forth. At the very same time, our shrinking global village puts us in touch with an endless array of options with respect to these very concepts that we've been asked to question. It can be liberating, exciting, and refreshing. It can also be disorienting. Old patterns of belief are being exposed to a scrutiny today rarely seen before, and we find ourselves disagreeing that which was given to us by our elders. We see other forms of Christianity that make more sense for us, and we see a lot of truth beyond our four walls of Christianity. And if the philosophical shift, which we can say more about, but if that is one hand of change, then the other one has to be the internet. And as you know, communication today is fast-paced, nonstop, and to large degrees over a device rather than face-to-face. As you know, I flew to get here. And once upon a time, in the airport or on the airplane, people still talked to their neighbors. Or at the minimum, they looked around. And now, truly, 98% of the people are on a device. We don't talk to the people around us anymore. During the pandemic, of course, the device allowed us to stay connected. And those of us who are joining, or those of you who are joining by Zoom, what a gift it is to stay connected even if you're at home. It's a gift. But social media also builds relationships on a virtual platform, limiting face-to-face contact. And we know that empathy part of our brain and body, is defined or developed through face-to-face contact. Without face-to-face contact, the empathy part of our body stagnates, or for our children, doesn't develop. News stories go viral and become intense fast. Online social media programs, Instagram, Facebook, and all those other things, they promote connection, but the connection can lack depth. When I go on Facebook, I see highly curated material of holidays that people are on. And I know people who, elderly people and young people, who are worried when they don't get enough likes on the posts that they put out. Our connection online lock us into a culture of perpetual comparison. Somebody once said to me, in the old days when you left high school, you were finally free of this perpetual comparison that high school puts on you. And now we've just extended high school throughout our lives. And to make matters worse, social media is drawn by algorithms, pings, and bot messages, meaning that we are easily addicted to our devices, and our devices reinforce our divisions and that make us vulnerable to false news. While some people no doubt thrive on the dynamics of change, most people experience change as at least partially or somewhat stressful. Others collapse under it. Statistics say, and there's a group that's been studying empathy rates and mental health distress rates among university students since the 1970s. And since the 1970s, empathy rates among university students was gradually going down. And then around 2005-ish, just around 2005-ish, they plummeted, like went off a cliff. And mental health distress rates went like this. And if you talk to anybody who works with university students today, you will know that the mental health crisis on our campuses is extreme. Our children are not okay. I've talked in this last little while with principals and vice principals and teachers at schools, and what they will say in one voice is that our children are not okay. The pandemic has hastened a mental health crisis that was already brewing extremely before the pandemic. My feeling is that it isn't just university students who are experiencing a loss of empathy and a rise in mental health distress. They just happen to be a captive audience that's easy to study. And so when people in this era that we're living in, including those who are hanging on to the church by a fingernail, are asked what they're looking for, they will say, inner rest, security, for a connection to divine in a whole new way, for a sense that there's something deeper, a purpose in our world, something more real and more profound, more grounding, more uplifting, something solid to lean on, something that makes intellectual sense and spiritual sense, something that appeals to head, heart, and spirit. And in short, what they describe is that they're looking for meaning, purpose, and belonging. In Europe, 500 years ago, technology also changed how people communicate. Remember, the printing press was new then. And at the same time, here, North America, the New World, was turning worldviews upside down. Suddenly, foundational beliefs and social norms were all up in the air. And if you think that we're polarized today, read some of the missives that went between like Martin Luther and Catholic leaders and so forth during that time. They are very difficult to read because they are so caustic in terms of how they spoke to one another during that time. People at that time were streaming out of the Catholic Church to start something new. These folks who were leaving the Church then, they are our religious forebears. They were the innovators then, and now 500 years later, we are in the same position as the Catholic Church was then, watching as people leave us, listening as people suggest that what we offer is not meeting their needs. And I'm not speaking just of Hyde Park here, I'm speaking about us collectively here, at the Christian Church collectively. What we easily forget is that Reformation 500 years ago also inspired a counter-Reformation within the Catholic Church. If you know the names St. John of the Cross or Teresa of Avila, they are people of that time. And by watching and listening to the people that were leaving, some within the Catholic Church began a renewal movement within that church to a great cost of their own lives. They began a renewal movement that continues to inspire people across the spectrum of spirituality to this day. For our purposes, it is worth paying attention to what our religious forebears and these Catholic leaders had in common. Both pursued an encounter with God's presence, so profound and so deep and so different from what was common in that day. Those people who went there, it left them utterly changed. Interestingly, the Gospels, they were written during a time which is somehow similar to what we've been talking about. Just like 500 years ago and just like today, the first century was a time of tremendous upheaval and change. Social norms were changing, cultures were bumping up against each other and causing shifts in how people behaved and thought. Politically, the regions of Judea and Galilee were on edge. Remember, Jerusalem fell just 70 years after Jesus was there. Then, just as today, there were people looking for a different kind of encounter with God's presence. With this in mind, let us consider our passage from today, Matthew 9, verses 14 to 17. I know you've heard it once. I'd like to read it again. And as I read it, think about, what do you think this passage means? Then the disciples of John came to him saying, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast often, but your disciples don't fast?" And Jesus said to them, "The wedding guests cannot mourn as the bridegroom is present with them, can they? The day will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast. No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth onto an old cloak, for the patch pulls away from the cloak, and a worse tear is made. Neither is new wine poured into old wineskins, otherwise the skins burst and the wine is spilled, and the skins are destroyed. But new wine is put into fresh wineskins, and both are preserved." If the meaning of the passage is ambiguous to you, don't worry, you're not alone. This passage has confounded theologians and pastors for centuries. When I first looked at this text, it confounded me too. Throughout history and even today, many people have interpreted this passage to mean that Judaism was wrong and that Christianity is right. But this interpretation has to be flawed. There was no Christianity when Jesus was preaching, and most people today would agree that Jesus was preaching within Judaism rather than trying to start a new religion. To understand this passage, let us consider it in its larger context of Matthew 9. And if you have time today, I invite you to read that passage when you get home, that whole chapter. Jesus is in Galilee, where he has been preaching, teaching, calling disciples, and healing a lot of people. If we look at this passage, or this whole chapter, we get the impression that Jesus' schedule is more hectic than any one of us here today. In chapter 9 alone, Jesus heals a paralytic, calls a disciple who's a tax collector, eats with sinners, many of whom are also tax collectors, heals a hemorrhaging woman, then a young girl, then 2 blind men, and then one who was born mute. And interspersed in all of these passages are questions and challenges from those who don't understand, including the Pharisees and John's disciples. The people that Jesus heals and those that he calls his disciples, all of them come from the underclass of society. If you look at Matthew 9 and you just go through who he is healing, and you look at who he's calling to be his disciples, they are always from the underclass of society. All these people are considered to be untouchable in some way. The writer of Matthew is almost breathless as he reports on Jesus' scandalous activity. And in the midst of this scandalous activity, we hear this dialogue between John's disciples and Jesus. I want to read the passage again, but this time from the Message, which is another translation of the text. A little later, John's followers approached, asking, "Why is it that we and the Pharisees rigorously discipline body and spirit by fasting, but your followers don't?" Jesus told them, "When you're celebrating a wedding, you don't skimp on the cake and wine, you feast. Later you might need to pull in your belt, but not now. No one throws cold water on a friendly bonfire. This is kingdom come." And he went on, "No one cuts up a fine silk scarf to patch old work clothes. You want fabrics that match. And you don't put your wine into cracked bottles." According to Jesus, this new thing that he was doing, according to this translation, is kingdom come. This time of tremendous upheaval is kingdom come. Certainly, our forebears, our religious forebears, saw their renewal movement in the 16th century as kingdom come. If this is true, then it is possible that this time that we're living in bears elements of kingdom come? This time of polarization and pain and exhaustion, are there elements of kingdom come in this time? Could it be that something in this time of declining church attendance, of people hanging on by their fingernails, of tension around how we organize our lives, our world, and our churches, could this be kingdom come? What would be required of us to see that which wants to emerge in this time? This last question leads us directly back into the Wineskins passage. Despite how the Message translates the text, during Jesus' era, wine was not bottled. Horses and camels can't carry rigid containers very well, such as ceramic or glass or wood, but they can carry animal skins, each filled with wine on either side of their back. And as a result, wine was stored in animal skins, known as wineskins. While wineskins are easy for transport, they're not so good in other ways. With time, wineskins, animal skins, become brittle and crack. Because new wineskin still needs to ferment, it will be expanding. And if you put new wine into old wineskins, that expanding, fermenting wine will crack those old wineskins, and you will lose both wine and skin. New wineskins, however, work really well for new wine. They are pliable, they stretch, and they accommodate this strange and bubbly new wine. Given that our passage appears in the middle of Matthew's passage as long report of the types of people that Jesus is relating to, what could this passage be trying to say? Remember, John's disciples, they ask this question immediately. The question that they're asking is immediately about fasting and why Jesus' disciples don't fast. They want to know about the difference between these two types of disciples. Seen in this larger context, it appears that Jesus is saying the following. 1, disciples can come in from all manners of contexts, including the uneducated, the unclean, and the outcast. That's 1. 2, it seems that Jesus is saying there must be permission for different ways of practicing one's faith. Yes, the Pharisees and John's disciples fast. Jesus does not call this bad. He even says that his disciples too will fast someday. But now, for now, his practice and the practice of his disciples is different. 3, Jesus appears to be asking for space to allow his disciples, these outcasts that he has gathered around him, to grow and to develop and to discover this new thing that God is doing. And finally, number 4, and perhaps most provocatively, Jesus also appears to be saying that the structure to hold the new energy of the new disciples doesn't fit with the old structure. The containers needed to support the new energy, we need new containers to support new energy, just as we need old containers to support old energy. It is worth noting that Jesus does not call the old containers bad. He does not call the old wineskins bad. In fact, if you look at the same passage in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus even seems to suggest that old wine is better. Listen to these words from the book of Luke. No one, after drinking old wine, desires new wine. Instead, they say the old is good. In other words, Jesus is saying new is not better than old, and old is not better than new. They are simply different from one another. I think the question that Jesus is posing for us is this: can old and new wineskins hang side by side in the wine cellar that we call the kingdom of God? Or using 21st century imagery, can an old bottle of wine, which is tasty and expensive, rest next to a new bottle of wine, which is maybe cheeky and experimental? Can old and new wineskins hang side by side in the wine cellar that we call the kingdom of God? Now, some of you might ask, but surely according to the gospel story, the old wineskins, the Pharisees, the John's disciples, and so forth, surely they were wrong, and the new wineskins, Jesus' disciples, surely they were right. Was Jesus not regularly upset with the Pharisees? And with this in mind, should we not throw out those old wineskins and the wine within them? Sadly, that would be like throwing out all of our old bottles of really good wine and keeping just the new, underdeveloped wines. It is true that Jesus challenges the Pharisees a fair bit, but he also challenges the disciples, his disciples, a lot. In fact, both groups get it wrong more often than they get it right. What Jesus also knows is that we need both types of wine to get it right. What Jesus is simply asking for is space on the shelf for both types of wine. Imagine you are one of the disciples in this passage. Are you more likely to be drawn to the old ways of doing things? Or do you find yourself looking for a different kind of energy when it comes to expressions of faith? In other words, are you more comfortable in old wineskins, or are you looking to leap into a new wineskin? Or if you think about newcomers or those who are not coming to church but still looking for meaning, purpose, and belonging, what type of wineskin are they wanting to leap into? Now, some of you might say what you'd really like is a blend of old and new wine. I don't know how that works with wineskins. I do know that the Spirit works in wonderful ways. We also know that both old and new wine emerges from the same grapes, the same grapevines. And so the question remains, can old and new wineskins hang side by side in the wine cellar that we call the kingdom of God? The difficult and hard truth for us here today is that we can't put new longings into old wineskins. I think that's a hard message for us. This is a really hard truth for the church to embrace. We so badly want our old wineskins to be good, to be enough. And the good news is they are enough according to Jesus. They just aren't good for new wine. So the question for your congregation, for all of us, is whether both types of wine can be stored in the same wine cellar. Can both those who love things the way they are and those who long for something different coexist alongside one another? Answering that question honestly is no easy task, but let's assume for a moment that you have reflected on this question and your answer is, yes, we do want old and new to coexist alongside one another. We do want to make space for new expressions of wine. We do want to become a place of meaning, purpose, and belonging in order to be an outpost of God's mercy in this world. The next question, if we say yes to that question, the next question that we will face is even harder. And that question is simply, how? How? How can two or more seemingly different spiritual longings coexist alongside one another? How do we make space for one another without judgment and without fear, knowing that people on both sides or all sides will make mistakes as we seek to create a community of meaning, purpose, and belonging as we seek to be faithful to God's call on our lives. Practically, this will have significant consequences for us, for you, for how we do church, how we think about ourselves and talk about ourselves, how we engage our communities, and how we structure our time together. Can old and new wineskins hang side by side in the wine cellar that we call the kingdom of God? My hope is that they can, because I expect in that wedding feast that Jesus talked about, that he would have been happy to consume both types of